So thank you very much for coming and listening to these presentations. And for those of you that are watching on TV, thank you for watching. I'm Scott Powell. I'm chairman of the Bolton Mosquito Response Committee. And I'm also a member of the Board of Health. In terms of our agenda this evening, we want to give you a brief overview of the committee and the work we've been doing. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the public health threat that the committee is focused on. So a little bit about the science there. So Dr. Amy Clark, who is a Bolton equine veterinarian, is going to lead that discussion. Organization, so he also can talk to the public health issues that we're going to talk about tonight. And then we're also going to have a presentation from the Central Massachusetts Mosquito Project. The executive director is with us tonight, Timothy Deschamps. And finally then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So we would ask that you hold your questions until after we get through the presentations. That way we can do it as efficiently as possible. And we're going to try and end no later than 8:30 this evening, but we certainly want to address your questions. So in 2019, Massachusetts saw a pretty significant increase in the number of mosquitoes in Massachusetts that were disease-carrying mosquitoes. And as a result, we did see a big increase in the number of Massachusetts citizens that, and also animals in Massachusetts that were confirmed to have been infected with either West Nile virus or Eastern equine encephalitis, commonly known as triple E. And unfortunately, 3 people in Massachusetts died last year from complications from triple E. So it's a fairly serious public health threat that we're talking about. And in the early fall, the state did have to reside in doing some aerial spraying on portions of the state, including parts of Bolton. So obviously that raised a number of issues, concerns, and questions from the citizens of Bolton. And upon the recommendation of the Board of Health, the Board of Selectmen appointed a mosquito response committee to investigate the issues and make some recommendations. So the objective of the committee is to identify and propose both proactive and reactive actions that we can take in Bolton to attempt to reduce the public health threat that we have from disease-carrying mosquitoes. And as we've been talking as a committee, and we've been meeting since mid-January and meeting every week and doing work in between meetings, the things that we really are considering as we look at the issues and alternatives is number one, certainly the public health, protecting public health. But we also give significant consideration to trying to minimize any environmental impacts, and then also consideration to trying to minimize the costs to Bolton taxpayers in terms of our recommendations. So with that, what I'd like to do is just ask the committee to quickly introduce yourselves. Perhaps we can start over here Amy, if you could turn on the microphone and
Good evening, Rob Frieswick, Director of Facilities, Neshoba Regional.
Good evening, Brooke Clenchey, Superintendent of Schools.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Schwartz, Corporate Counsel with a women's healthcare company. And before that, I was Corporate Counsel with a world-leading environmental services company servicing energy, water, and wastewater projects throughout the U.S. and Canada, and I'm a citizen volunteer on our committee.
Hi, I'm Ali Webb. I'm the Parks and Recs Coordinator and a resident of Bolton.
And there's one other person that I should also mention that has been working with this committee since its inception, and that's Kristen Zena. She is the Bolton Health and Permitting Assistant, and she's done a tremendous amount of work for this committee, and we really appreciate that. So thank you, Kristen. So as we've been discussing the issues and deliberating, the areas where we think Bolton needs to be doing more to address this public health threat is really four categories. And the first one is around surveillance. And this is a really important category. Today, we really don't know if there are disease-carrying mosquitoes in Bolton. We rely on other information from other towns, but we don't have specific information about Bolton and within Bolton. So, you know, this is a significant problem, and one that we think needs to be addressed, and I'll talk about other reasons why we need more surveillance as well. And by surveillance, I mean of the mosquito population and whether there are any disease-carrying mosquitoes, and if so, you know, what diseases are they carrying. Second is there are things that we can be doing proactively to reduce mosquito breeding grounds, where that may be trying to eliminate stagnant water, doing better ditch maintenance, and you know, we do have some sites in Bolton with lots of, you know, old tires, and those are really significant breeding grounds for mosquitoes. So there's lots of other things that we can be doing proactively to naturally reduce the mosquito population. The third one is communication, a communication strategy. If we identify a public health threat in Bolton due to mosquitoes carrying disease, we need to get the word out to citizens. We need to do that quickly and efficiently so that they can make their own decisions about how to deal with the threat, whether that be limiting outdoor activity, being more vigilant about applying repellents, or whatever makes sense based on the nature of the threat. And then finally, a response plan. If we do have a public health issue that's been identified, what is our response? Is it limiting activities? Is it various treatment plans that might be recommended depending on the nature of the threat? So we need a response plan that we can implement, relatively quickly. And this is where surveillance also comes in, because one of the things we need to do on any actions that we're taking is we need to make sure it's having the desired effect, that it's working, and if not, then we need to address it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Amy Clark.
So I'm Dr. Amy Clark. My presentation tonight is going to talk a little bit about virology, what a virus is, how they interact with us and our environment, and specifically how they affect horses, although the disease presents similarly in people, and a lot of what happens in horses we can translate to what happens in people. So to remind us all, a virus is a strand of genetic material that is coated by a protein or lipid layer. It is dependent on a host animal cell to replicate. So without a host, the virus dead ends. So it's relying on mammals to replicate its DNA. Causes disease in certain susceptible hosts, depending on the damage to the cell that it's replicating within. The genetic material of a virus can be either a DNA or RNA virus. We'll talk a little bit more about later. A vector is usually a mosquito or a tick, which is capable of transmitting the virus from host to host, and that's how the virus continues to perpetuate in the population, is by transmission through vectors. A reservoir host is a passive carrier of a virus that is not affected or does not show symptoms of the disease because of the virus. A dead-end host is a host in which the virus enters and the virus can't replicate to a level which can then be picked up by another vector or another mosquito and transmitted to another host. Dead-end hosts are usually symptomatic and often severely debilitated or fatal due to the disease. So morbidity, there's a few terms that you'll see when you're reading. Morbidity is just the condition of being affected by the disease or having the disease. Morbidity rate, and there's different ratios and rates that you'll read out there. So the ratio of disease to healthy animals. Mortality rate is the death rate. So what percentage of affected animals are dying? RNA viruses, EEE, Eastern equine encephalitis, is an RNA-specific virus of the genus alphavirus and family Togaviridae. RNA viruses have a much higher mutation rate and ability, therefore it's harder to develop vaccines to them because the nature of how that virus replicates within a host, it's often mutating. Other RNA viruses that we see in the population are West Nile virus, in people, SARS, coronavirus, both human and animals, hepatitis C, yellow fever. These are all types of RNA viruses that can be very serious, some of which are vector-borne. So EEE specifically, the host or amplifying host is passerine or tree-perching birds. So they are often not affected by the disease, but the virus replicates within their system. Snakes, rodents, and other small mammals can also be reservoirs for the virus, so they can carry the virus as well and have mosquitoes feed on them and then transmit the virus. Specifically in Massachusetts, the mosquito type Culiceta malinura is the primary vector which is responsible for transmitting EEE. And other mosquito types can feed on infected birds, become carriers of the virus, and then transmit it to other mammals or people. Those are called bridge vectors. There's a cyclical emergence of the virus within the population that has to do with bird migration patterns, populations, and feeding patterns. rainfall amounts and temperatures, which affect our mosquito populations. And the virus itself, and the mutation of the virus goes in cycles where there will be several years where it's a more virulent or disease causing virus. Over time, the bird population will develop immunity to the virus to some level. We'll see a fall in the disease, and then the virus will mutate again. So that's why we tend to see waves of the virus. And so there's a nice, go back one, sorry. A nice graph here that just shows the red circle going around is the disease life cycle of how that virus is maintained within the population. So the virus goes into the vector, which is the mosquito. It feeds on a bird, reinfects another bird, and so on. The green lines coming in are things that can affect that virus. So weather, climate, bird feeding space and habitat, and then our effect down lower on the life cycle of the vector. If we can affect the vector, we can affect the virus's ability to perpetuate in the environment. So triple E in horses is also known as sleeping sickness. The incubation period is 3 to 7 days. So that means the time from when the horse is bit by a mosquito carrying triple E and enters their system, 3 to 7 days before symptoms develop. The morbidity in horses and mortality rates, so the effect of the disease is very similar. 75 to 90% of horses will show symptoms if they're bitten by a triple E carrying mosquito. And of that affected 75 to 90%, another 75 to 90% of those will die. It is fatal. Horses are dead-end hosts, so they are not at a risk to other animals or people. The disease can't be transmitted from a horse to another horse or human, and it's the same in people. Clinical signs of the disease are depression, lethargy, drowsiness, why it's called sleeping sickness, anorexia, so they just don't want to eat. These are all very vague but early signs of the disease. It progresses quite rapidly from there. Fevers of 102 to 104, stiffness and hypersensitivity to touch. They can be aggressive or excitable because their mental state is altered. And they'll show a variety of deficits from head pressing, wandering, chewing, facial paralysis, limb weakness. Usually the disease progresses to the horse being down and unable to rise and is then followed by death or humane euthanasia. So this picture is a horse affected with triple E, probably in about day 2 of the disease. And that horse is being held up by a sling and supported with IV fluids. And they're 1,200-pound animals, so that's very difficult to do and very expensive. So just a short video, and we won't watch too much of it. This is a foal that had triple E, and I'll talk a little bit about it as the video runs. For those of you who don't know anything about horses. So this is a young horse, it's a foal, and you can see the handler is trying to get the foal to walk, and it just won't move. Foals are typically very sensitive. They're young animals, they're not used to human interaction, and they tend to be a little bit flighty. So here, this foal just doesn't want to move. It doesn't react when they reach towards its face, towards its eye. It doesn't try to protect itself. This foal did end up being euthanized due to the severity of the disease and the poor prognosis. We'll just skip over the next one. So there are commercial vaccines available in horses, so we can fairly effectively vaccinate our horses against triple E. Although when you read vaccine literature labels, they're combined with other diseases, and it will list specific efficacy rates for everything except for triple E. So it is not a 100% effective vaccine in horse, but is fairly good. The diagnosis, if we think a horse has symptoms, are acute and convalescent, so after they've recovered blood samples, that's only if the animal survives the disease. The bottom picture on the left is collecting a spinal fluid sample from that horse, and it can be tested for the virus and show very unique patterns that are associated with EEE. Can be a little bit difficult to receive those samples in a neurologic horse who doesn't stand still or can't stand still. So histopathology of brain tissue. So because this disease is very similar to rabies, if a horse dies or is euthanized with suspicion of EEE, we also need to be suspicious of rabies, and we need to submit that brain for testing to confirm that it was not rabies, because that is also a significant human health threat. So treatment of the disease is really, there is no treatment. As we saw on the slide before, it's supportive care. It's trying to keep that horse alive, keep that horse hydrated and fed through a nasogastric tube that goes up their nose and down to their stomach. We can give them anti-inflammatories to try to manage some of the inflammation and swelling in the brain, and vitamin E, but there are no antiviral drugs that are effective against EEE, and that is the same in people. So why is this important to us, to our community, and to those of you in the room who don't have horses? Animals are often our first indicators of developing diseases and environmental issues that may be a signal to problems to come for people. EEE is only one of many emerging vector-borne diseases. There are more that will come with global travel and climate change, and we're seeing reemergence of some other vector-borne diseases in other countries that were thought to have been controlled or eradicated. Some arboviruses, which are mosquito-borne viruses, have mutated that they now can perpetuate within a human-dependent mosquito population, so they can exist in a population of mosquitoes that primarily feeds on people as their preference. So there typically were in other mosquito populations that preferred other hosts for feeding. We've seen a change in that in some viruses in some areas of the country. And those virus adaptations can occur pretty rapidly. EEE in some literature is also cited as having the potential for biologic warfare use because the virus can be aerosolized. So during the process of performing a necropsy, collecting cerebrospinal fluid samples, if anyone breathed in any of that fluid, they would become infected with EEE. That's the only way an animal or a horse can transmit EEE to people. But the virus can be aerosolized and does have devastating effects. There's no vaccines for people. Even equine vaccines are not 100% effective. There are some experimental vaccines for use in birds, which is a great idea because birds are the primary host that amplifies the virus and maintains it in the environment. But they're experimental. They're not widely used, and unfortunately, lots of great vaccines have been in experimental stages for 15 to 20 years, and unlikely to ever leave that stage. It's very serious if symptoms of infection develop in any species. So monitoring and research continue to be warranted to better understand and prevent disease, and this takes a collaborative effort. So this is a great chart that I found in some of my research. So we're the very bottom green circle, we're the community members, and what can we do to improve research and understanding of the diseases and monitoring of what's actually happening out there in our environment. And that's coordinating with local health departments and local vector control and monitoring organizations, state health departments who are then coordinating with bigger, broader agencies, both in the US and internationally, as well as then that information being relayed to universities and research facilities and drug companies that can further the research and bring that information back to the local levels. And I do have some references, and there are some printouts of my slides up here. If anyone wants some of these reference papers, they have some really interesting information that I found very fascinating as I was reading. Most of them are actually human papers, so that's my presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Amy. And now, Tim, if you could come up and give the overview of the Central Mass Mosquito Project, that would be great.
Thank you very much. My name is Tim Deschamps. I'm the Executive Director at the Central Mass Mosquito Control Project. How do I advance? Thank you. Next. We are a state agency. We're organized under Mass General Laws Chapter 252, and each of the districts that are formed in the state have their own enabling legislation. Ours is Chapter 583 of the Acts of 1973. All the mosquito districts operate under the authority of the State Reclamation and Mosquito Control Board. That's the state agency that oversees us. That board has members from Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, Department of Conservation and Recreation, and the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. We also work very closely with Mass Department of Public Health. There's a map of our current service area. You can see the communities in green, current members of our program. Bolton I circled up near about the center, a little bit to the top. And the town of Grafton is in yellow because they voted at their last fall town meeting to join the program. Mosquito control in Massachusetts is unique. You know, despite the fact that we're a state agency, communities can choose to belong to the program through town meeting vote. So this just briefly some services that are offered to communities that are in our program. You see the rundown there, and I'll go through each of these one at a time. Mosquito surveillance is capturing adult mosquitoes, identifying them to species, and then species that we are concerned with for disease transmission to be tested for these viruses that could be carried. We do have a variety of trap types that we put out in our service area. All of our communities receive mosquito surveillance and testing at least once per week. We deploy approximately 675 traps in our service area, which currently is 42 communities. If we do identify a virus, Mass Department of Public Health will notify the local community first, and then we're the second one on their list, and then we do coordinate with our boards of health and other stakeholders in each of our communities to determine what the appropriate response would be. And Mass Department of Public Health does test for the Triple E virus, West Nile virus, and several other viruses of concern. There's a map of our current trap deployment. You can see the communities again in the slightly darker green, the communities to the right in the lighter green, and the communities to the bottom in the peach color are communities in a different mosquito control program. All of the communities in white currently are not part of our program, and you can see Bolton being ringed with towns around it and surveillance traps around it as well. So I would estimate at least 10 to 12 trap sites in Bolton, probably more. The Bolton Flat area is an area of concern because mosquito viruses such as Triple E have been found in that area several times, going back to at least 2010. So some surveillance data from just last year. We did test 2,416 individual specimens. That's from 6,585 total. There are several mosquito species that we will collect that are not of concern for disease transmission, so not all of these samples do need to be collected. We did, of those, the first number are the collections that were sent in. So the collections could be up to 50 mosquitoes. We did test 56,374 individual specimens. That's from over 205,000 specimens collected in total. And each, again, mosquito that we bring into our laboratory does get identified as species. Last year we did identify 38 viral isolates. 28 of those were Triple E, and there was a small scattering of West Nile virus as well. Public education is an important part of our program. We do offer educational programs through the school systems by our staff entomologists, typically K through 5. We have a biologist on staff that During his master's program in public health, developed a specialized program for senior citizens, and then of course we do a lot of informational programs like we're doing tonight. So again, we have educational materials we put in our town halls and our libraries. The school program is very popular. We generally see anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 students a year. We have a full service website that residents can put service requests in, see labels of the pesticide we use, find out virus information. We do pretty involved in social media, getting out the message about our program through Facebook and Twitter. And then we do additional public presentations as well. You can see last year we did 109 presentations in total, over 4,000 attendees. And then that's just a brief breakdown of the school, the senior program, and the public program. You see the senior program was a little light last year, so that is something we're going to work on for 2020. Ditch maintenance is restoring drainage systems to their historic flow patterns. Mosquito larvae can only develop in stagnant water. So we do have a wetland scientist on staff that will assess these areas. Once we secure property owner permission, we will go in there and again restore this historic flow pattern. We do have low ground pressure equipment that's specially designed for some of these larger projects. But again, we only do this work after the receipt of property owner permission, and any of the work we do with our heavy equipment is also coordinated with the Conservation Commission as well. Larval mosquito control is identifying mosquito larvae in wetlands and then doing applications at that time, typically of a bacterial product. So this is just a list of some of the products that we use for larval control. I would say primarily BTI is the product of choice in 99% of our wetlands. There are organic formulations that we are currently using. Spinosad is a different type of bacteria that is not as specific as BTI is, so we're using those in some limited situations. Bacillus sphaericus is another bacteria that is specific to mosquitoes themselves. Then there's an insect growth regulator available to us, and we do some limited use for the surfactants and the oils. Source reduction is removing the source of mosquito larval habitat. For us, that means tire recycling. We do have a full program of recycling tires in all of our communities. Residents can call the office or put in requests through our website for curbside pickup. We have significant tire piles database in our service area that we work with the property owners to do cleanups of those as well. And we've also become pretty important communicating with our communities during hazardous waste collection events, Earth Days, etc. And to date, we've recycled over 32,000 tires. So those are 32,000 sites that a technician does not have to go out, does not have to monitor, does not have to do an application of a pesticide ever again. Beaver mitigation is the proper management of beavers to reduce any potential negative aspects of their activity. Again, our wetland scientist, she's a former conservation agent, will determine if beavers are causing an issue in an area. Then we do work very closely and under the permitting process through the boards of health and conservation commissions. Typically to date, we've installed about a half a dozen water level control devices to try to bring water levels down to a point that we're minimizing the negative effects, but also allowing the beavers to persist in that area. We've done some dam breaching in areas that beavers have left the area, and we do have licensed trappers on staff, but to date we have not done any trapping yet. Adult mosquito control is the spray program most people are familiar with about our program. We're currently using a pesticide called Edofenprox. It's a 4% solution. It's classified as reduced risk by the EPA. It's not a residual product. It has a very rapid decomposition in the environment. Spraying that we do at night is gone by the very next day by any sensitive test that could be done. And Edofenprox has a very low toxicity to humans and pets. It's a very commonly used pesticide, especially for flea and tick control on dogs. Again, it's a very dilute solution. We use 4%. The standard flow rate out of the back of a pickup truck is 4.5 ounces a minute, which equals under an ounce per acre. An acre, of course, is 43,560 square feet. And again, all the applications that we do are truck-mounted applications. The aerial application that was done last year was coordinated by Mass Department of Public Health and Mass Department of Agriculture. We did assist on some trapping and some of the legwork, but it was all done by those two departments. The way the adult mosquito control program works for our office is we rely upon requests from residents. So if no service requests are received from residents on a given day or evening, we do not do any spraying. However, other work would be done in all of our communities during the summertime. Larval applications in catch basins, education, tire recycling, etc. All of the trucks that now have new tracking systems in them, so they're GPS tracked. So all of the areas when the sprayer is spraying are located on a tablet that are downloaded each day. So these areas are detailed in a new reporting system. If virus is identified in our community, again, it's very important for us to communicate with the town to determine where the virus was located and what the proper response would be. Sometimes our recommendation is to spray. However, there were several instances last year that we identified virus late in the season. Spraying would not have been effective. It would have been too cool at night. So our recommendation was not to spray. It was just to continue to push the public informational message, use repellents and other personal protections. Residents do have the ability to exclude their property from any part of our program, typically the pesticide applications. They register through the Mass Department of Agriculture through a new process. There's an online process that works very quickly, gets to our office within a few minutes. All of our tablets have these locations database in there, so as the technicians drive their trucks and they approach these properties, the property is outlined in red and they get audible and visual warnings as they get close to it. Those are updated on a daily basis. And not to rely too much on technology, all the technicians also carry paper lists with them as well. We do have a pretty strong notification process. We send out monthly schedules to all of our communities at least 2 weeks prior to the start of each month, just letting them know when we have each community scheduled. And then as the spray requests come in, or if there's virus situations, we put a detailed street listing on our phone system by after 3:30 each day, as well as our website. So residents can call our phone system, listen to a recording. If they have additional concerns, they can press a button and get sent to an answering service. And then the website, of course, is available. It's been recently revised, so it's now scalable for smartphones and tablets. Research and efficacy, it's important for us to check to make sure that the products we're using are still working, and also new products and formulations that come out to see how well they may work. So it was a new department for us in 2007. It's a checks and balances to make sure that what we're doing, again, is effective. Some past studies we've done in the past, mosquito blood meal analysis, trapping mosquitoes that have blood in them, sending them for DNA testing. Pesticide resistance testing is done annually down in Florida, where pesticides are used just about year-round. It's a very important program for them to make sure that the pesticides being used are not having resistance developed in the insects they're trying to control. For us up here, it's not as much of a concern because the spray that we use, as well as homeowners and other private companies, are not done year-long, but we do consider it to be an important part of the program to continue to test each year. Adulticide program efficacy, we put out traps before we spray, traps after we spray to see a reduction, telling us that it worked. Host seeking activity, when are mosquitoes most active? The ones that we're trying to get as mammal biters. And then we have, for about 10 years, we would send out resident surveys to let them know let us know how well we were doing in their opinion. And that's my contact information. We do, again, at www.cmmcp.org. I did bring printed materials of my presentation tonight, as well as a brochure and a services manual that's been recently developed, which again explains our program in a little bit more detail. All that information is available on the website if you look at the button on the lower right, which I believe says program presentation. Thank you.
Great, Tim, thank you. And Tim, if I could ask you to just stay up here. We're going to do questions and answers. I have a hunch we may need your assistance. Okay, so Kristen just asked me to ask you if you do have a question, if you could just state your name. Just so we can keep track of where the questions are coming from. So I'll open it up to the floor. Any questions based on what you've heard? Yes.
Type of spraying we do is called ULV, which stands for ultra low volume. Most of you that have private applicators are going to have these applications done during the day. They're going to come out with a backpack. They're going to spray the foliage. Those are typically residual pesticides, so that when the mosquito lands in that foliage the next day or for a week or more, they're controlled in that way. They're operating, of course, on a profit margin, so they have to do the best that they can do without getting a call back. Ultra low volume spraying that we use is done after sunset when mosquitoes are most active. The host-seeking studies that we've done show that mammal-biting mosquitoes are active from about sunset to about midnight, and then again from 2 in the morning to around sunrise. Also, for the protection of pollinators, the state's had a policy in place since 2007, which does not allow us to spray until after astronomical sunset, only until sunrise itself. So the ball fields, for example, as we spray, it typically drifts out in an open area like that about 300 feet. So the better access we get from the trucks, of course, the better control that we get. But it's not necessary for us to necessarily get right up to those wooded areas, because mosquitoes are coming from those wooded areas to the open areas as part of their ability to look for a host. They're looking for something to feed upon. During the daytime, they're resting in shrubbery. They're protecting themselves from sunlight, from wind. But at nighttime, they're actively flying. They're looking for birds if they're a bird species, a mammal if they're a mammal species. So by us spraying at night, we can use a much weaker solution in a much smaller amount. Ultra low volume means we're breaking that pesticide up into 20 to 30 micron sized droplets. These are very fine droplets that mist out. It's like a large aerosol can on the back of the truck. So we don't need to put out these larger volumes, these wettables that are put out by the private applicators, because our technology is different. What they do is effective, and if it's done properly, won't have necessarily a negative impact on the non-targets or the beneficial insects. However, by the way that we spray, we can get much broader coverage. Mm-hmm. Right. BTI is almost exclusively the bacteria of choice. BTI is also very exclusive to mosquito larvae. It does affect a few species of midge, and it does affect black flies. However, any other aquatic insect that eats BTI would pass through it without a problem. The way BTI works for the mosquito is mosquitoes have a very specific pH in their stomach. So when they eat the BTI, that pH then activates the toxins in that bacteria, and that toxin kills the mosquito larvae. Other insects, and salamanders, ducks, etc., come in contact with that bacteria, and it has absolutely no effect on them at all. It's a naturally occurring bacteria that, again, we're fortunate enough there's actually organic formulations available to us as well. The other bacteria that we use, spinosad, does have a wider control on its label, so we use those in much more specific areas that we're not as concerned about the non-target impacts, more enclosed type of ecosystems. And then the Bacillus sphaericus, the third bacterial that we use, is very similar to BTI, where it doesn't have any other impact on any other either invertebrate or vertebrate species. Well, you are correct. If you look at the label for edofenpox, you'll see a variety of different insect species. By using a lower percentage and a lower flow rate, we're only putting out enough to really impact the mosquitoes themselves. Mosquitoes are small, they're soft-bodied. It only takes 1 or 2 of those 20 to 30 micron-sized droplets to control the mosquito. Other insects, such as a dragonfly, if they were to encounter those small amounts of Edaphragmopox, they shouldn't have any issue with them at all. You'll also see on the label that it will impact honeybees. Honeybees is a very important part of our ecosystem. We do encourage our beekeepers to register their locations as an exclusion. In many instances, these beekeepers will actually ask us to spray. So as long as they know when we're coming, they'll protect their hive. We can do our application, because again, that next day, that pesticide is gone from the environment. So, and then you mentioned fish as well. Fish is labeled is on all the pyrethroid labels. So we have a minimum 100-foot setback from any fish-bearing waters, again, to give protections to the fish-bearing, to the fish waters, etc. We also operate under a federal permit. It's a federal NITDES permit that designates if there's any negative adverse impact from any part of our program, anybody, citizens, town officials, state officials, can put a report in through the EPA and an investigation has to be initiated. We've been under that permit now for 7 years, and to date there have been no investigations initiated. It's really about the timing of the pesticides, the amount of pesticides you're using, and being smart about it. Many times a resident will put a request in and the technician will go out. He needs to determine, are mosquitoes present in that area? We're not going to spray a non-residual pesticide if there are no mosquitoes. We can look at our light trap counts. They can perform what's called a landing rate, where they stand and count the number of mosquitoes that land on them. Sounds a bit silly, but it's a very effective means of knowing exactly what's going on in that situation at that time. They also have to look at temperatures. Label dictates no spraying below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That makes perfect sense because mosquitoes aren't really flying much below that anyway. And then there's a wind direction, a wind speed, on the label as well. So they have to look at what's the current wind speed as well. We just started last year to set up all our trucks with ultrasonic weather stations so that they can get right on their tablet the current wind speed, the current wind direction, the current temperature, and it is offset by the vehicle speed. Currently, they carry small handheld weather stations that they can, put out and see what wind speed and what the temperature is. But very soon, but hopefully by the end of this year, we're going to have all that computerized on the tablets as well.
Let me go to, was it Jim? Oh, okay, great. All right.
It's not water soluble. So if it does get on the water, it's going to stay on the surface of the water. Then the daylight, when it comes out, is going to break it down very quickly as well. And again, it's going to be a very fine mist that, if I were the truck, it's going to come out here and it's going to fan out. And even by the time it gets back there, you may not even see it anymore. So again, observing those setbacks from fish-bearing waters is important. But if a misapplication were to occur, again, we've never been notified of any fish kills. And when the planes went over, they have tracking systems in those planes, and they avoided water drinking reservoirs and things like that. And even with the offsets that they use and the wind, they're flying 150 miles an hour with wind. Basically, what a lot of people don't understand is where the plane flies, the pesticide lands about 2 miles away. A lot of people say the plane came over me and I got doused. It isn't possible because they were putting out very small amounts as well, but there's a significant drift. But even after the aerial applications they did, there were no reported fish kills. So if a misapplication were to happen, again, it's a very extremely small amount that's going to break down very quickly the next day at the latest.
Oh, we're still waiting for you. Okay, go ahead. So earlier I talked about the things that we really think we need to do more of as a community because of this public health threat. And, we have looked and thought about, other ways to practically address a lot of those topics. And, this program seems to make the most sense. It's the most practical way to get the surveillance, to get, scientific expertise, to help us, with the tires that we have in this rural community. There's lots of aspects of this program. There's a reason why the state created these programs by law, so the communities can pool their resources and address these problems. And we do, when we talked about it as a committee, it was a unanimous vote. And we've got a broad cross-section here of people from different perspectives. We're hard-pressed to come up with anything that would be practical in terms of doing things that we really need to be doing. We do have control, over what happens and how we respond to a public health threat. Tim has, assured us of that, so that's an important aspect. Yeah, yeah. And I don't think, go ahead, Ali.
Do you want me to come up just for a second?
Absolutely.
I just think that it would have to decide on how much risk we had. I mean, hopefully it would mitigate any need to shorten sports on the fields. But if we went into a higher risk, we can't guarantee that. We'd have to react to, the disease that we had in town.
What most communities will do is follow the recommendations from Mass Public Health. You're correct. Lancaster was designated as either a critical or high-risk community. Mass Public Health makes a recommendation. The community themselves are the ones that make the final decision. But I think in these circumstances we saw last year, those recommendations that were followed were correctly done.
But I think as Amy indicated, we made some of those decisions without a lot of information, without surveillance. We, really could not even consider any kind of treatment plan, if that made sense. So the prudent thing to do was to restrict the activity. Obviously we'd like to avoid that, but the public health is the highest priority. So I think you have a question for Amy. At this point, you know, I think that's likely. I mean, certainly we want your input on, you know, this suggestion, but you know, I think my personal response, I mean, I think we'd have to cross that bridge when we got to it. Hopefully that won't happen, but I think it would depend on what the reasons were for, you know, the concerns. And, you know, we would do our best to address, you know, those concerns in other ways, but I think that would be very difficult for us to do. We probably would need to be a lot more cautious about, you know, our recommendations. I mean, certainly communication is going to be important, and that's something we can do, you know, regardless. And I think, you know, we owe it to the community to try and do better in that regard. But it will have an impact on, I think, what we recommend. So I don't know if
we made 2 sequential applications in September. It's a natural product. It was called Tick Kills. You know, we thought that we're not allowed to spray, obviously, pesticides when children are in school. So, you know, out of an abundance of caution, we went with that product just to try to mitigate, you know, any risk to the children. You know, we have the extended day program where the children are there early, they're there later on, in the day, where, the exposure, was a little bit higher. We have early morning recess, so there's some exposure there. So that's why we felt it was best to make those applications, just to try to mitigate, any sort of risk there. So, we looked at that, the cost associated with that, as opposed to what the cost would be for, joining the program. It was quite high. So, I think the best bang for the buck with the surveillance and everything else is to, go with the mosquito control project.
Stasha, I don't think you've asked a question yet. Go ahead.
You're welcome. Absolutely, and each year before it comes out as a final product, we are involved in the draft process as well. It doesn't change too much year to year. Some numbers might change, obviously, with last year's situation. Some of that will change, but absolutely, our partners at Mass Department of Public Health are very important to us. It was mentioned earlier about equine cases. One of their spokesmen is the state veterinarian, Dr. Katie Brown. So she's very knowledgeable about mosquitoes and vector control and horse cases. So yes, it's very important for us to coordinate with them, work with them, and lend our expertise and have them lend theirs to us. Which restrictions specifically to Still River? Okay, our program has been reviewed. All of our pesticides have been reviewed by the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, the agency that oversees endangered species. They have not put any restrictions on any part of our program, including truck-mounted spraying. The only restriction that has been put on is methoprene applications in some wetlands. If we wanted to do an application of methoprene, we would coordinate with them. They would then review the actual wetland to determine if it would be allowed. Typically, all our methoprene applications are in catch basins anyway. But our truck-mounted spraying, again, is not restricted in endangered species habitats. And that's another agency we do coordinate very strongly with. We have all their maps in our GIS program, so we do know their locations. We also need to check those locations as well for the ditch maintenance program, because if we do identify ditches in endangered species habitat, we coordinate with them as well. Technicians have good experience in determining where the spray is going. Obviously, once the spray leaves the nozzle, we don't have control over it. So as they're spraying, they're looking at wind speed, they're looking at wind direction, and they're going to give buffers around these exclusion properties, whether it be a residence, home, a beekeeper, an organic farm, etc. So as they're spraying, if the wind is drifting it in that area, they're going to shut their sprayer off significantly before that exclusion zone, and then not start it up again until they get well past it. Where the conflict arises in our program is when we have a spray request within that buffer zone of an exclusion. Does happen on occasion. We process over 20,000 spray requests each year. We probably have a few hundred listed exclusion areas. In that instance, the technician will first make contact with the exclusion and let them know what the situation is. In some instances, the no spray may say, okay, fine, just make sure you stop at this point and I'm going to go to the movies tonight. Other times the exclusion is like, you absolutely positively will not spray anywhere near me. In that instance, then the technician goes over to the request property and explains the situation. He doesn't think that he can do this application without impacting the exclusion property, therefore we're not going to do that application. However, we can still offer service to that resident. We can offer them our educational materials. We can do surveys of their area to determine are there larval sites that we may not know about that could be treated. Do they have containers holding water that can be tipped over, recycled, etc. So on occasion, it probably happens a half a dozen or a dozen times a year, one of our techs will turn a request back in. There'll be a notation on it and just listing that too close to a no spray. So in that instance, again, and it almost never gets above us, but if either the exclusion or the request property wants to go over our head, there's obviously people above us, State Reclamation Board, that can speak to them and explain the situation that we're currently in. So just to reiterate, they do not do the applications unless they can be reasonably assured that they won't have any negative impacts. Correct. A well-trained technician that has a tablet in front of them that shows them where that exclusion property is outlined. We have all the maps and parcels and getting that audible and visual warning. Trust me, the last thing any of these guys want to do is spray and no spray. And I was a tech for 15 years. And even back in those olden days, we were very careful around the no sprays. We're trying to provide a service to protect human health and also not negatively impact people, whether it be from the mosquito-borne disease or the pesticides. We understand that people have issues with pesticides. It doesn't matter that I tell you it's a 4%, rapidly decomposing pesticide that's gone the very next day. It's still a pesticide. It's something we take very seriously. It's a risk-benefit. What is the greater risk? What is the greater benefit? I explained earlier, there are times, as we get late in the season, we might see mosquito-borne virus that we don't recommend an application of the spray product. It's probably going to be too cold, the mosquitoes are not going to be that active, or maybe the population just is not high enough to that point to really justify that application. We don't do the application, but there are other things that we can still provide to the public to try to get the risk as low as possible. Yeah, the best way is through the Mass Department of Agriculture Resources website. They do understand that not everybody has web access. There's a paper form that can be filled out as well. When they mail the paper form in, you have to understand it takes a few days for the form to get there. Someone in Boston has to open it, has to get to a certain department. Absolutely, it's very... Right. Town of Grafton is a good example. They're just coming into the program. They've not been a member of our program since 1988 or 89. I've already communicated several times with both Town Clerk and Board of Health. Please get our information out, but more importantly, get information out about the exclusion process. The regulations were revised a few years ago. Prior to that, the exclusions had to be filed before March 31st. Honestly, who besides us is thinking about mosquito control in January, February, and March? And we worked with the state to get rid of that date. Now exclusions can be filed at any time of the year. So if it comes in August 1st, again, if it's electronic, it gets to my computer within a matter of minutes and it's put in our systems a day at the latest. The regs give us 14 days to incorporate it in. We've never taken more than 3 days, and that's accounting for a Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning. So again, the no sprays that come through electronically are immediately put into the system. The ones that come through the paper form, there's going to be that inherent delay involved as well. But yes, anything the town can do to get that information out. If in the past, towns would collect these properties and send us the list. We don't recommend that now, only because in order to be, quote, officially recognized as an exclusion, they have to follow agriculture's exact specification. But It's really not that difficult, and there's been many occasions that we've had people call our office and our office staff has put the exclusion through for them. Not really supposed to, but, you know, again, not everybody has computer access, and, you know, we do understand that.
We have a question over here.
Basically, all of the above. There are action thresholds for all of our pesticide applications. So in order to justify a spray application, it would be a minimum of 1 mosquito per minute at a landing count. That's when the technicians stand in a wooded area, count the mosquitoes that land. We do suspend landing counts when virus is identified in the state. We're trying to minimize risk to our employees. Another action threshold is more than 2, I believe it's 2 biting mosquitoes, mammal biting mosquitoes in our light traps. And there's also a third action threshold, I never quite understood how it got in there, of 2 service requests in a geographical area considered to be a mile. Basically what happens is we publish a schedule each month. Bolton will be, and I'm making this as an example, on Tuesdays. So on Tuesdays, we'd have a technician scheduled to be in town. During the daylight hours, he's gonna check wetlands, do applications for larvae. He's gonna do applications to storm drains. That's another area mosquito larvae will develop in. If there's ties, he could possibly do collections there. If there are service requests, he can give education to these people. And if there are service requests, he'll do those landing counts. And then after sunset, if the weather's cooperating, wind speed's less than 10, temperatures above 55, he'll do those limited applications around where the residents' properties are, taking into account any exclusion areas or other areas that he needs to be aware of to stay away from. So really the amount of spraying in each of our towns is determined by the residents themselves. In many of our communities, we don't do a lot of spraying in. I've always felt the strength of our program is we can tailor it to meet the needs of the community. Many of the communities up north, Tewksbury, Wilmington, Billerica, heavily dotted with wetlands. There's a fair amount of spraying that does get done up there. Other communities, Gardner, Lowell, 2 bigger cities. We work in Worcester now for 2 years, but even down in the Milford, Hopedale area, the wetlands are more pocketed, a little easier to control. The spray requests don't tend to come in nearly as frequent. It might be a couple of dozen to 100 or so in some of those other communities. So again, it's going to be at the level the residents have determined.
Jenny?
It can vary. When a resident puts in a request, there is a field to put in any sort of notations. Again, 300 feet is a calculation we use for our pesticide use reporting. It's best case scenario, open field, no obstructions. There have been tests done down in New Jersey that show that the spray actually does go around or over houses, believe it or not. But if a resident has a long driveway, certainly, you know, in Bolton there's a lot of long wooded driveways, and they put a request in and they give us that authorization, we can come down the driveways as well. Again, the request system is fairly flexible so that you know, the residents can kind of get as much service as possible. They're not notified specifically, however, they can find out where our spray trucks are going to be by using our notification system, either again through the phone or the website as well. Spray requests that put in through our system are notified by email, and we're currently trying to work with our vendor to see if we can get a separate list of anybody in general that wants to get a notification. They're having a little trouble dealing with that because of some geocoding on addresses per town. In other words, we don't want to have a list of 500 people get notified every night that a truck's going out. Our goal would be to have only the people in Bolton get a notification when spraying is happening in Bolton. So right now it's something that the residents would have to check on themselves. We don't have the ability currently to send out a push notification, but we are working on it. We're hopeful it'll happen soon.
Jan, I think you had a question.
mean, just some general statements. I mean, as was pointed out earlier, all of our program is designed to minimize use of pesticides. You know, tire recycling, no pesticides; ditch cleaning, no pesticides; education. We do recognize there's risks involved in using pesticides. We're using the lowest risk pesticides available to us. There are plenty of other products available that we could use, but there's more negative, either environmental impact or human health harm. As far as bats go, we do encourage bat conservation. We are concerned about white nose syndrome as well, but just in the general sense, because most testing from bat stomach contents show less than 3% of their diet is actually taken up by mosquitoes. It's really a classification of expenditure of effort. A bat is going to be much happier getting a large moth or beetle than the appropriate, dozen or 2 dozen mosquitoes that would approximate the same amount. So again, bats will eat mosquitoes, yes, but that number that gets floated around has been kind of moved. Sometimes I hear more, sometimes I hear less, but there's a lot of mosquitoes, they'll eat some of them, but do they control mosquitoes? They do not.
Jan, I read that fact about the bats as well, and I took a look at the study that number of, I don't know, 1,000 or 10,000, whatever it was, mosquitoes, and it was based upon bats being released into a controlled environment, like a room, only filled with mosquitoes, and they counted how many they ate and killed the bat and then opened it up in a certain amount of time and then extrapolated, well, it could eat the 10,000 per night. But as Tim pointed out, the mosquitoes in a natural habitat only comprise like 3, or I thought it was 2% of the bat's actual prey. And so I think other sources are questioning whether that extrapolation of the bat, because my first inclination when I first joined this was, well, let's get a bunch of bat boxes, right? That's a natural and kind of homeopathic remedy. And the more that I dug into it, the less convinced I am. In fact, I don't think that would be an effective remedy to be either proactive or reactive. And then it made me question the validity of those numbers. So I just wanted to share my findings with you.
But I think, we appreciate the input. The committee's talked a lot about, the real desire to not use pesticides, to do everything we can. But we also have a public health concern that we need to address as well. So anything we can do to reduce the mosquito population naturally, we're all in favor of. And, I think the other important thing is the surveillance to know whether we have a real problem or not. I'll let Tim answer that, and the question about, whether we could not do the spraying. It is a flat fee. It's $57,000 annually for the town of Bolton, based on current rates. But Tim, how about the spraying topic?
Yeah, we don't allow any part of the program to be opted out of because each program lends itself to the other parts of the program. So in other words, if we take one part of the program out, it's going to make other parts of the program less effective. In one of my slides when I listed the services, I listed adulticiding or spraying as a reactive response. That's true to a point. However, I'm of the opinion that if we can kill a mosquito before it becomes infected with mosquito virus, that could also be considered a proactive response as well. So in communities that get all parts of the program, they're going to see a better benefit than they would at communities that, for example, only went with a few different parts of it. The assessment that was quoted, $57,000, is approximate at this point. It's determined by land area and this equalized evaluations of the town. So it is a formula that's set out by the Department of Revenue. Comes off the local aid assessment, so it's not a direct tax appropriation. However, I do understand that the town will see that much less money in local aid, so therefore, the money needs to be made up somewhere else. I do understand that process. So I don't want to say it's a free program, it's state money, because reality is it's a reduction in your local aid. But it's not a budget line item or something that a property tax would see an increase on, so it's not that.
I think another consideration is, we have people hiring lots of contractors spraying pesticides now. If we utilize this program, there's a better chance that there's science behind it. There's real effort to make it, a safer product and a safer application. I think the other thing is, to the extent that we can do everything to avoid the aerial spraying that went on, that's another consideration as well. I mean, we can't guarantee with this program that that's not going to happen, but the more proactive we are, the more we can demonstrate that we don't have a significant health risk in Bolton. Hopefully the less we see of that being necessary.
A lot of the communities that were higher critical risk last year in the Metro West area actually were not part of an organized program at that time. Yes, there were communities that belonged to our program that went high in critical risk. Thankfully, in most instances, our surveillance program gave the public additional time of notification that this virus was circulating in the environment, in their community or a nearby community. It is a difficult thing to assess how effective is our program in areas that it's not used in versus areas that it is used in. It's a question I often hear, and honestly I don't have a really great answer for you. Just to simply state that as a public health option, one would not allow a community to have a public health situation and not do something, just to compare it to a community that has the same situation and do something in it. So again, it's not quite apples to apples. I understand where you're coming from, but on our website we do have some cost-benefit studies. There are some papers that have been put out looking at some conjecture on how much it does reduce the incidence of disease. But the communities that we found virus in, we found it early. We got the word out. Other communities that did not have a surveillance program sometimes didn't even know until a horse got sick, or unfortunately possibly a human as well, because there were human cases in non-member communities this past year. So.
When you were doing your surveillance and spraying last year, we all saw the maps every day, every week. They grew from the yellow, and then spread up, and the orange spread up, and then the red spread up. We didn't get here. We didn't have a surveillance program, so we didn't really know. It was just a guess. Yeah, it was just south, 1 or maybe 2,000. But when you were doing spraying in the communities that were south of Bolton, in your presentation, you talked about there's a measure of the effectiveness of the spraying. Did you do that last year? And was the spraying effective, meaning you had less landings or less, in the traps after spray applications than before?
As a general rule, yes. We did not have the opportunity to do a lot of efficacy data on our truck spraying last year because of the aerial event. Mass Public Health was using our staff to run traps to show efficacy on the airplane application. We did see some reduced trap counts in areas that we did truck spraying in as well. But again, these traps tend to be designed to capture as many mosquitoes as possible. So they're not always within a spray zone. They might be significantly further out in the woods, because again, we're trying to capture as many mosquitoes as possible to determine population densities and whether there's virus in the area. So we didn't have the ability to put out light traps in general locations of our truck spraying, but however, we did do some trapping for public health for the airplane event.
Did you see effectiveness in the aerial spraying?
There was a reduction. I can't give you numbers right now.
No,
I believe they're still
generally
working.
Speaking,
Yes.
they're spraying. Okay, so I think a generalization answer is to your question of, well, if there was a problem in the communities south of us and they were part of the program, a component of the program is this reactionary spraying. How do we know that it's effective? It's because they take a look at the traps and they do it. Now, in this instance, they were assisting the state with the effectiveness, to figure out the effectiveness of the aerial spray. But I think the headline on the answer to that is it probably could have been a lot worse if there wasn't any spray, either through your program or the area, right? So that red would have been a lot more pervasive, is what I guess.
I said we were going to try and wrap it up at 8:30. Are there other questions surrounding topics we haven't really addressed or talked about? Stasha, can we do one last thing in there?
Obviously, especially in places where children congregate, it is something that our town officials feel a great dedication to, and this is a potential help towards something better than what we have. I love the surveillance. I love the communication. I love the tire recycling. I do get hung up on the spraying, and I have also been in many town meetings where it's gotten denied, I think, for whatever reasons. And so in an effort to get something passed, it sounds like there's a real hardship to folks that have, soccer games. My kids have played soccer way past 7 o'clock on those fields, so I have been down there getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. I heard Mr. Deschamps say it's an all or nothing. This program, we've got to buy in from spraying as well as all of the other really good proactive things that come out of this program. And so if we're taking public comment, and this is to help you guys inform something, and again, with a true desire to see something productive pass at town meeting, then you may consider a breakout somewhere there where we can get the surveillance, and we can, private homeowners that feel strongly one way or the other are going to do their thing one way or the other. And I think what happens is it keeps getting hung up in town meeting because it's all encompassing, which the state tends to do. And
Yeah.
so as a town, I'm speaking just as a townsperson.
Yeah. So I mean, to kind of wrap up, we really appreciate all the comments, and we're going to go back and talk about the feedback and try and assess where all of you are coming from, and valid point, Stasha. The one thing I will say is because I was at the last presentation, and I think this program has come a long way in terms of the technology that they're using. More scientists, more concern around the environment and the pesticides. So, that's great to see, but your point's well taken, and let us talk about it. And there's certainly other ways you can give us feedback, email, and talk to the committee members. But really, this has been really helpful, and we really appreciate your attending tonight. Yeah, I mean, we're really working hard to try and get the word out, about our meetings, about recommendations, through social media. But yes, we definitely will make sure you understand what we're going to propose, and appreciate the support. Okay, great. So I think with that, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you.